Okay, welcome to this semi-plenary contrasting emphases in Earth system governance, decentralization, multilateralism, and deliberation. And my name is Karin Bäckström. I'm at Stockholm University, and I'm very pleased to chair this session, where we have a very interesting lineup here with speakers. So this session will discuss and contrast different accounts of how to approach environmental governance and natural resource governance, from more centralized multilateral ways to decentralized or even participatory and deliberative ways. Also debate how to reconcile public and private interest in environment governance, the promises and pitfalls of these decentralization, centralization strategies. So I will briefly introduce the speakers. I don't think they need a lengthy introduction, but first we have Aaron Agrawal. He is a professor at University of Michigan, and he had the keynote speak at the first day of the conference. Extremely interesting. One of his books is on environmentality, technologies of government, and the making of subjects. Then we have Frank Bierman, the chair of the Earth System and architect of Earth System Governance Project. He's a professor in sustainability governance at Utrecht University. And his latest book is titled Earth System Governance, World Politics in the Anthropocene. And finally, we have the host of the Canberra conference, John Dryzek, professor here at the University of Canberra. And his latest book, co-authored with Haley Stevenson, is on democratizing climate governance. So we've decided on a format like this. We will have 3 15-minute presentations by each of the speakers, followed by comments of a few minutes on the other presentations. And then we will open up the floor for debate. So, first out is Frank Bierman on the more multilateral approach to environment governance.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thanks so much. So this is kind of, I think, a very interesting session. It's a bit more like a round table originally, so I think we all don't have written and published papers about it. It's more like an open discussion about some of the key concepts that are always in debate, and they're all kind of important for our considerations in terms of Earth system governance. So I start a bit off by talking about some of the concerns that I have with some of the concepts. And I believe, if I look at the program in a sense, these terms such as decentralization, centralization, top-down, bottom-up, many of these terms that you have in these debates, they are actually problematic concepts. They are sometimes false dichotomies that are in a way destroying the integrated understanding of Earth system governance. And importantly, and this is the second part of my talk, they might also have very important political consequences that we have to take into account when we deal with these kind of concepts. So I have a couple of concepts now that I find problematic, especially from the global perspective. Because I think with some of these concepts, we have a difference between an understanding from the perspective of local governance and understanding from the perspective of global governance, where certain terms, certain experiences, certain concepts might have a different meaning and also different political consequence when you use them at the local level and when you use them at the global level. So I think the scaling up of concepts is a very problematic activity in these kind of endeavors. So I talk about some. First of all, there's this one kind of bogeyman, this strawman that's built up that multilateral institutions are kind of the attempt of building up a cockpit, or it is an attempt of constructing or deconstructing a cockpit at the global level of Spaceship Earth. And some people even say this is what Earth system governance is about. And this is certainly not the case. I think there is no cockpit on this planet. We don't have one. We don't need one. We will never have one. This is a totally wrong assumption in the way on how we can think about global governance, local governance, Earth system governance. It will always be, in some form or shape, a polycentric activity that includes local activities that Arun will talk about, but also multilateral institutions that I will talk about. So, secondly, I think there is this talk, and especially in the climate regime, we heard about probably later in the plenary on climate discussion, about the difference between top-down and bottom-up governance. And I think this is a totally false dichotomy. I believe there is actually no top-down governance with global institutions. It just simply doesn't exist. I think it suggests a power of international institutions that we don't have. It sets a normative hierarchy that just doesn't exist. In a sense, what we're dealing with in global governance are collaborative arrangements among nations. There is nothing, there's no element of top-down that would justify this term. There is no hierarchical steering. I give you some examples just to kind of discuss this idea about what is actually top-down. For example, the Forest Stewardship Council. Is it top-down or is it bottom-up? Many would say, well, this is all private actors, NGOs are involved, this is bottom-up. But what is bottom-up about it? Isn't it a central mechanism that sets standards at the global level that are somehow applicable for all of us? So you could say this is also a type of top-down. So what is bottom-up? What is top-down? How can you use it? The same for the city alliances. Is this bottom-up or is it top-down? Can you say the mayors of Shanghai and London, New York City, these are bottom-up actors? They would probably not see themselves in this category. The same for the G20 or G7 or these kind of small country alliances. Is this top-down or bottom-up? I think nobody can really say. So I think I want to make the point that these are very problematic, very confusing things to say. But I think also I come later to that the discourse on top-down versus bottom-up also has political connotations. The same is in a bit about centralization or decentralization. I think centralization, decentralization has a particular meaning at the local level. I'm sure that Arun will talk about it. And some people say that it has a positive connotation, maybe a negative. This is what Arun will discuss at the local level. On the other hand, if you say centralization or decentralization at the global level, there is, in my view, no possibility anymore to decentralize because this is already the most decentralized system we have. In our field, environmental issues, 1,300 treaties, 193 independent nation states, more than 100 international organizations. You cannot imagine a system that is even more decentralized than what we have. So I think this discourse about central or decentral at the global level in the multilateral arena is totally misplaced. And again, I think that the debate about centralization and decentralization at the global level has also a certain political agenda behind it, and I'll come back to this. But just some examples again. Is this centralized or decentralized? Technically, it's just a couple of governments. I mean, this is one of these famous photos from Copenhagen. So you can say it's just a couple of governments, so very decentralized, only 5 out of 190. But on the other hand, I mean, you can also say this is extremely centralized because these are the most powerful players getting together. So is it centralized, decentralized? Probably you can't really say. Is this centralized or decentralized? Technically, there are two chaps, only 2 governments out of 193, extremely decentralized. This is really small n government. But others might argue this is actually a very centralized procedure. So again, a concept that is being used in discussion, but I think at the global level, pretty meaningless. Again, another concept, the claim that multilateral institutions would be per se undemocratic and unaccountable. This is also what you find in newspapers from time to time. Bureaucratic organizations, undemocratic, unaccountable. This is how the UN is being portrayed. But the question is, are the alternatives that we sometimes hear, transnational agreements, private sector, civil society, industry, is this a better solution? Is this really more democratic? Probably John will talk about this a bit. This is the Marine Stewardship Council. I like to show this also because it shows, in a sense, the high degree of organization that private institutions have, the power they have also, and the voting system that they have developed. My question is, to what extent is this more accountable than traditional multilateral democracy, diplomacy? Or another example, these are some of the actors that are very important when you talk about private institutions, civil society maybe at the global level, as opposed to government-run activities. But again, the question, is this more democratic? Is this a different type of accountability? This accountability, difficult to say. Mark Zuckerberg and this girl that just lost 99% of her inheritance, which is probably not a magical thing. So it probably... Anyway, but she will probably be one, I mean, this foundation will probably be one of the most important actors. They might find the Earth is governance, who knows, whatever. But this is, and I will be very willing to talk to them. But anyway, so, but the question is this really more accountable? Greenpeace, I mean, I'm a big fan of Greenpeace. I think they do great stuff. But when you talk about Greenpeace, you have to talk about these numbers. This is where the money comes from. Germany, United States, Nordic countries, Netherlands, and Switzerland. I mean, this is the funding base of Greenpeace. And of course, they're great people. Many of us work for them. But this is the financial basis. And as you know, we have to follow the money. So I'm very sure this is also a factor that influences decision-making processes. And especially when you are from one of the countries that is not part of the biggest funding organizations. So I think, to sum up the first part, that these discourses in global governance that say that global governance should be decentralized, it should be bottom-up, these normative discourses you sometimes see in the debate, I think they can be misused. They can be. They don't have to be misused. I think we can have an analytical debate about it, but I think there's also a political agenda behind them that is hiding maybe a neoliberal agenda that favors rich and powerful countries, that are losing out in a system that is more decentralized, more bottom-up. Instead, and this is my argument, I believe that multilateral institutions can be progressive arenas that hold powerful countries accountable and that also support the poorer countries in these multilateral settings. So I think multilateral institutions sound maybe a little surprising. I think they are progressive actors. And I think this is one of the reasons that I invest my time, most of the time, and my private research time, in studying these kind of actors and try to improve them. I mean, if I look at this kind of famous quote from Ronald Reagan, he says the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And this is a discourse, I mean, this is from Reagan's times, but I think this is the discourse we have these days about the UN. I think many actors would now replace the word government here with multilateral institutions. So I think the same critique that we have now for the decentralization, bottom-up approach to multilateral institutions has its origin, maybe, I don't blame everybody, whatever, but I think there's a certain parallelity between these kind of discourses from the neoliberal emergence under Reagan and Thatcher and all the others with what we see now in the bashing of multilateral institutions. So I think there's a certain similarity, and I think that's also important to think about. And if you think about multilateral institutions, you think about what is their target, what is the most important task for global institutions. And I think this is equity and inequality. This is something we have to look at. And I think this is something that is very important for multilateral institutions. They are important in this matter. I don't say that they will be effective. I'm not also kind of dreaming in the sense that this will be resolved. But I think these institutions are important to address this slide of tremendous inequality on our planet, which is the 20% own 80% or 85 people own 3.5 billion. You heard the talk of John Barrett yesterday. It's on the same line. And I think to address this tremendous inequality, we can't rely on decentralized governance. We can't rely on bottom-up procedures. I think we have to work, in a sense, in multilateral settings that give the weaker countries, the majority of our populations, a voice in these activities. And the same is the case for holding rich and powerful countries accountable. I mean, this is this quote. I mean, some of you know more about these discussions from an American negotiator who said, there's one thing we just simply don't accept, which is liability and compensation for loss and damage. Point. Full stop. So this is kind of one statement. I think decentralized governance, a very, very weak system, is not able to address this normative position. So I think to really help poor country, we need also to have strong multilateral institutions. And then the good line is, despite all the criticism, I think it's also, they are actually not that ineffective. I mean, there's always this kind of standard assumption, multilateral institutions never work, have never worked. I think this is despite all the problems maybe in climate or many other issues, there are many, many areas where multilateral institutions work actually quite well. And this is something that's always forgotten, especially because of the carbonification of our debates, in the sense that everybody's hooked up on the one climate debate, and this is kind of then being used as an example for the entire rest of the planet. On the other hand, I think this is a major issue. What we have in multilateral institutions is not up to the challenge. It's essentially an outdated system that's not able to address all what I have said in the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. So, good. So I think what we need, and I think this is my personal research, and it has nothing with the Earth System Governance Project, to be clear, my own personal work is to fix this photo, to get some fresh ideas in it and to have some fresh agendas that can strengthen multilateral institutions and make them better up for the challenges of addressing inequality and unaccountability at the global level. But this is a book that was mentioned. This is, by the way, my daughter, very important. She's symbolizing the new generations in this book because I think it's very important. And well, this book, I try to lay out some of the core ideas. I mean, some suggestions. It's not necessarily that it's a very conclusive book. I think there are lots of kind of spots that need to be more elaboration, just a little attempt. And I'm very happy to continue working on these issues. I mean, 2 points I want to make, and then my time is over.
You have 2 minutes, 3 minutes more.
Well, that's exactly what I had expected. Good. So, I mean, number one, I think this is one thing that I think is especially important nowadays. I think this might be one of the most progressive discussion areas is voting reform in multilateral institutions. So right now, I mean, it's largely consensus-based in many instances. And I think this is one of the key problems that the decision-making process is essentially taken from the 19th century. And I think this is a problem. The other problem is I don't have a solution, or nobody has really a solution. And I'm looking at Luc Kemp, who has written a lot of work on this. So if you want to know about it, I mean, read his work, papers, articles, and whatever. I mean, just some of the main problems we have to work on. One country, one vote would mean if you have a voting like this is what the UN system is, that 5% of human population hold 50% of the votes. If you would say, let's say one person, one vote, very democratic, that means 7 countries have 50% of the vote, also not acceptable for most of our constituencies. So we need somehow, that's I feel, a compromise, some novel ideas on how to organize this. Luke has some proposals. Actually, there are not that many other proposals out there, so you have found your niche in a way. But I think this is kind of a debate that we have to lead. How can we really make a decision-making system at the global level that is effective and accepted? And then, of course, you have to look at the realities of politics, accepted by all the important countries here. Another example, this is how can we bring in civil society. I find this very important. How can we bring in different voices in intergovernmental settings? And here are kind of a couple of proposals. I'm not proposing any one of them because I find them all problematic. But I think these are the 3 core proposals that are out there. People say, well, let's bring in civil society and form a global forum of civil society. Like there's one proposal of saying 600 representatives of civil society. This is how we should organize it. Has certain problems. I come back to this. World Parliamentary Assembly is one proposal. And then John's proposal and his colleagues about setting up a global deliberative assembly, which will not be based on ideas of voting and representation, but on deliberation. I think he will probably talk about this. So these are 3 different ideas or rationales in a way of how to make intergovernmental settings more accountable to citizens in a way. Nothing of that is being implemented. It goes into these directions to some extent. Like if you take this rationale of the global forum of civil society, examples are in a way this major group approach, which is in a way kind of the representation of special interest, but also in a way that many people would say is not very representative because it has 9 groups, many are not represented, the procedure, how it has been defined is not very clear. So that's also very problematic. The World Parliamentary Assembly has a lot of support. There's a huge campaign on that, actually, really kind of a big NGO fighting for that. Many left-wing European parties are supporting this idea publicly, but also it has many questions. There's simply the question who's sitting in this assembly exactly. And then there is a global deliberative assembly, which John will maybe talk about, or he could talk about if we give him the time anyway. And there's a question, it's not existing. When nobody has it, it's a proposal from John that's not implemented yet. It goes a bit in this direction if you look at global online consultation. I think this is one of the proxies, maybe John will disagree, but these kind of online consultation that we had and the Rio process that we have now, but even here there are also lots of problems. I mean, Carol Ancenito sits there, she has done a lot of research on this, and she has identified biases in the sense that some of these online consultations that she looked at, they were, what was it, 50% was from 4 OECD countries and they were all English language speaking. Australia was one of them. Canada, United States, UK, I think. And they were dominating the online debates. I mean, this is what happens also maybe when you have these things. So in sum, I think that what's important is that Earth system governance or any of these governance processes, it has to be somehow polycentric, so it has to involve local actions and global activities. That's very important. It must be a combination of global governance, national governance, local governance. My argument is the global governance level is tremendously important and it has to be studied, but it doesn't mean that local activities are not important. I mean, people who study cities are all equally important. It has to be a combination of 2. It should not be an either or that you sometimes feel in the debates that people spend their weekends and their times in their panels of discussing what is more important, the UN or the city alliances, the NGO meetings or what happens in New York. This is not the right question. Both is important. And equally, everybody has to kind of engage in the one or the other debate, and we have to work together, and this is a challenge, I think, for the Earth System Governance Project, to link these levels, to link people, different communities, different discourses, and bring them together, people who study in New York and people who study in the villages, to have a joint discourse, compare what can you learn from each other, and how can you integrate this. And importantly, I also say UN can be also a lot of fun. So this is a tribute to all my Korean friends. Good, thank you so much.
defense of multilateralism and also call for reform of it. And a nice bridging over that we need both to Aaron, who will speak on the promise of decentralization and local government.
So I was asked to talk about decentralization, which is a difficult word. I don't really see myself in many ways as working on decentralization. So when John said I should talk about it, I thought, what am I going to say? So, there's an amazing thing. If you go on Google Pictures, you can type any phrase you want, and it'll spit out pictures at you. Like, it'll never say, oops, there's no picture for that. So I typed decentralization, and these two pictures kind of say what I have in mind, or what I think of when I think of decentralization. First, and it corresponds to two, I think, very general meanings of decentralization. Decentralization is about getting people involved with what you want to happen, people contributing and people doing things together and getting things to work. And a very critical or a very powerful critique of decentralization that it's really about getting people to do what the powerful want. It's a mechanism to get people involved in regulating themselves. And so, what is decentralization? The first picture is like, everybody working together to get something done. And the second is like this poor guy. I think of this as some big national government carrying the weight of the earth on his shoulders. And then he figures out decentralization. And then he gets everybody else to do the work, and he doesn't have to carry the weight anymore. Now, which of these is right? Is decentralization getting people involved in government so that they are all powerful? Or is it getting people to do what the powerful want? And the answer that I want to give is both, is yes. And I want to say that by talking about three different, so we think of decentralization as a process, but today I want to make the argument that it is not one, it is three processes. It is three processes that each have their independent but related standing. And in that sense, decentralization is about governmentalization. It's about the penetration of the things that we do by the idea of having a direction. It's government not in the sense of the state or in the sense of a government agency. It's in the sense of what we want, what we do, or what we try to do becoming connected to what many others would want to do. So there's a restriction of autonomy in some sense in contexts where decentralization happens. And government itself, so penetration of what we do by government, and government in the sense of purposive action, not in the sense of centralized government agencies, purposive shaping of conduct. So when I think of decentralization, and given the fact that I work primarily in contexts that are not the United Nations or large multilateral institutions, but finer scale or more micro level workings of government, I think of decentralization as having these three different dimensions, or three different features. It is governmentalization of localities, and localities I mean both inside the things that are inside your head, but also localities in the territorial sense. I mean formation of the regulatory community, and I will talk a little bit about that, and I mean the creation of new subjects. So effective decentralization, or decentralization when it works, encompasses all of these three processes. It's not just about the standard definition of decentralization, which is reallocation of authority from some centralized location to a bunch of different distributed or decentralized locations in some sort of territorial architecture, right? So I think of decentralization as being different from the standard definition of decentralization, which, in fact, I've used myself, but I don't think that is the right I don't think it's the right way to think about decentralization. Right? So what do I mean by these three different processes that I suggest together constitute decentralization? One, the governmentalization of localities is really about changing the relationship between some centralized or some located exercise of power and the different units that are subject to or that are related to that exercise of power. So it is a shift in the relationship of localities and more centralized governmental agencies. What does that shift mean, or what does that shift constitute? It constitutes paradoxically, or in some ways maybe even very obviously, more power to localities. So local decision-making bodies, as a consequence of decentralization, expect to gain more power when decentralization is effective. But at the same time, they are less powerful in the sense of being less autonomous. So the more power that they get is for undertaking lots of different kinds of activities. So in that sense, they have more power. They maybe get more resources. But the way they are supposed to exercise that power is in line with some direction. It's not that now I have $30 instead of $5, so I can go out and stay in the Sheraton instead of some local bedroom inn. No. It's about doing the things that you would be required to do by that centralized authority, and therefore some restriction of autonomy. And because autonomy and power are not the same thing, you can have more power and still have less autonomy. And the way this exercise of power between the centralized and the decentralized authority works as through decentralization is not so much or not necessarily by imposition of sanctions, but through an effort to get both those who are exercising power and those who are being acted upon or those who are being subjected to power coming to see or coming to recognize that this direction in which they're supposed to act is the right direction. It's not, they don't need to contest it. It is okay. It is in their own interest. So this effort by decentralizing authorities to involve those who are at a lower level in this effort at decentralization is based less on domination or based less on saying you must do this or else, although that threat is always present. It is more based on you must do this because this is the right thing for you to do. You must protect the environment because protecting the environment is the right thing to do. Okay? So that's one aspect of decentralization. The second is the creation of these bodies as autonomous bodies, as able to do things on their own, but do things on their own so that they can regulate those whose actions are ultimately the target of decentralization. You're supposed to recycle, you're supposed not to cut down too many trees, you're supposed not to graze too many sheep, you're not supposed to get out too much water from the local water body. These are all things that the local decision maker does, but in a similar way as there's a consonance or effort at creating a coincident interest between higher and lower level authorities, in a similar way, there's an effort at creating that similar recognition of what is the right thing to do between local decision makers and those on whose behalf those decision makers are supposed to be exercising power or spending resources. So there's a dispersal of decision-making locations. Decentralization is, as Frank also said, it's not about a single administrative or powerful body making all the decisions for everybody. It's about letting 100 flowers or 1,000 flowers bloom, letting many trees grow, and then all of them then come to understand what is the right thing for them and do that so as to extend what might be called the reach of power into the finer spaces of the social body, so that the body itself becomes an instrument of power. So there's a new relationship between local residents and local authorities, and this relationship would not work were it not taking advantage of a whole range of different social and economic and political relationships that pre-existed the effort to decentralize. So you can't expect local communities, because they don't really have that kind of coercive power, to be effective in exercising power, were they not able to count upon the relationship that the decision maker at the local community level has or had with all the people who are living or who are a part of that community. So the exercise of community power builds on the presence of a whole range of different kinds of social relationships. And finally, what I think is also critically important for decentralized authority to work is this idea that people come to regulate themselves. And again, they come to regulate themselves because they see themselves as doing the right thing, as being interested in and as being motivated to do the right thing. They recognize that it's important. You recognize as the subject of a decentralized power that there's a need to regulate yourself. You can't just go out and do whatever comes to your head. What comes to your head needs to be regulated itself. You can't just have everything coming into your head, because having everything come to your head, you could go out and do mischief. So you need to regulate yourself. And in the case of decentralization of environmental policies, people come to recognize the environment as being something in relation to which they need to think, in relation to which they need to shape their activities. So the ultimate success of decentralization is about a shift in how you think about your relationship, or how the subject of decentralization thinks about his or her relationship to the environment. If that doesn't get accomplished, all of the building blocks of decentralization, the two other processes that I outlined, would also not work. So to my mind, decentralization is about all of these three things happening together. At one level, isn't that a great thing? Everybody wants to do the right thing. At another level, isn't that just horrible, that we can't think differently? And that, I think, explains the highly divergent and different assessments of decentralization as being something that gets people involved in doing the thing that is necessary. It gives power to the people, and that it really is getting people to do the will of power. So I'm going to stop over there. And I don't know if I took 15 minutes, but that's all I have to say.
You have a few extra minutes.
Okay, well, I give them the job.
Thank you, Aaron. I think it really is interesting very important how you pay attention to the role of power in decentralization. I think in environmental governance there is a lot of naivety in the promise of decentralization as a silver bullet to everything. So now our last speaker, John, will talk about the promise of deliberation, which can occur on different levels, from local to international.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. This semi-plenary session is not a debate; it's more of a deliberation. That it is, as the program says, it's three emphases, or perhaps a better word might be three dispositions towards environmental governance. When it comes to global governance, though, I think there is a debate between the multilateralists, like Frank, and those who favour a more polycentric, decentralised or experimental approach to governance. So I'm thinking of people like Matthew Hoffman and his book on climate governance at the crossroads, David Victor. So it seems we do have some sort of fairly clearly drawn battle lines there. But those lines themselves are becoming increasingly blurred, it seems. At the presentation in the summer school last week, Frank, in answering a question, both criticised polycentrism and expressed his sympathy for polycentrism in the same sentence. So there's a bit of a blurring there. On the other side, I think was it Karen? Somebody was telling me that Matthew Hoffman, in a tweet in reaction to the Paris Agreement last week, was really very positive, almost ecstatic on the. Was that you? Yeah. Yes. Was that Karen? Yes. So Hoffman seems to be buying into the multilateral camp, which he had so thoroughly criticised in making the case for more decentralised, multifaceted network forms of governance. So the lines do seem to be blurring. If you were, I think Aaron mentioned in his plenary address the other day, in terms of what his reaction to the Paris Agreement would be. He said we would look at the the stock price of the fossil fuel companies on the Monday, and I think the coal companies did go down slightly, but the oil and gas companies, I think, maintain at the same level. But if we were looking at the stocks in multilateralism, it seems that they've gone up in the last week. So, in the debate in this global debate between multilateralists, and the more polycentric or decentralized folk, a common argumentative strategy is to highlight the failure of the other side and then assume that one's own proposal is better than that. This is the argumentative strategy of people like Hoffman, of David Victor, and maybe even Eleanor Ostrom in some of the work that she did on polycentrism, where you start with the failings of the UNFCCC, for example, and then just elucidate the alternatives. But none of these people have actually shown that the alternatives actually do better. What do they add up to? What do all these decentralized mechanisms add up to when in terms of greenhouse gas emissions avoided or potentially avoided in future? And there's really no accounting there. On the other side, Frank, in his Earth System Governance book, laments the failures of fragmented governance, and it's easy to see those. He contrasts those with what he calls his realistic utopia, which is a reform multilateralism. So what Frank is doing there is comparing his realistic utopia with a flawed reality. Should we allow the decentralists their realistic utopia to compare with the flawed reality of multilateralism? So how do we resolve this conflict then? It seems we'd need a lot more empirical comparison across regimes, maybe even across states. At the moment, we don't have enough of that sort of systematic empirical work, which would enable us to help resolve this debate, which really is a debate, as opposed to the contrasting emphases or dispositions which we have in this room today. Okay, let me move to deliberation. Deliberation is actually somewhat agnostic on decentralization versus multilateralism. Would argue that both have to be deliberative, and perhaps both have their place in deliberative systems, of which I'll say a bit more shortly. The Deliberative Global Citizens Assembly that I wrote about a few years ago is one such deliberative proposal. It's not supposed to capture the whole of deliberation, the whole of the normative project of deliberative democracy as applied to the global system. It's actually a relatively centralized mechanism in itself. Deliberation is, I believe, a universal human capacity. It is manifested differently in different cultures, and it is very hard to think of any kind of system of governance beyond dictatorship, which can possibly work without some measure of deliberation. So in that sense, we need, whatever the context, however decentralized, however centralized, we need to sort of think about how to make things more deliberative, to make governance both more effective and more legitimate. When it comes to environmental governance in particular, Lovebrand and Kahn, in a book chapter a few years ago, refer to the deliberative turn in green political theory. There are a lot of people writing on deliberative democracy and the environment, mostly positively, attracted a few critics as well. Actually, I had a long list of about 20 people, some of who, actually about 20 or 30 people who have written on this, some of whom were at this conference, most of whom are not. I'm not going to read the list. Some people might be offended if I left them off. Some people might be offended if I put them on it. And some people, I think, like Karen Backstrander, really, I find quite ambivalent in her attitude towards to deliberation in environmental governance. I should also note that beyond the Earth System Governance community, there are also deliberative Democrats in the field of ecological economics, including some of the leading figures in the field, such as Dick Norgard, my co-author, Rich Howarth, who have been led towards deliberative democracy, often by the weaknesses, the shortcomings of deliberative monetary valuation. Okay, what can a deliberative emphasis contribute to environmental governance? There are a standard list of claims. These are the sorts of claims that one finds in the literature. I'm not going to go through these. This is a fairly, it's not necessarily comprehensive, but this captures some of the kinds of arguments that are made. Do we have any evidence that these theoretical claims, most of the claims on this slide, are made by green political theorists? do we actually have evidence that the positive promise of deliberative democracy at the theoretical level actually is realized in practice? We do have, well, to cut a long story short, we do have positive evidence at the micro level when it comes to citizen forums and looking at the effects of deliberation on the positions that citizens take within those forums. We have much less evidence where arguably it really matters at the macro level. So one of the few studies which does look empirically at deliberative democracy at a more macro level is the book by Backstrand et al. On environmental politics and deliberative democracy, published a few years ago, where they find that new modes of governance, which can be seen as more or less deliberative, actually are not that different in their environmental performance from more established modes of governance. Though I would question whether those modes of governance really are especially deliberative. Just because they're sort of more cooperative and decentralized doesn't necessarily make them deliberative. Deliberative democracy, though, is not a falsifiable hypothesis. We can't look at particular instances, particular cases of particular empirical cases, and look what happens, and then if things seem to work out badly, conclude that deliberative democracy is thereby falsified. Deliberative democracy is more of a normative project. I said earlier that I think it's that deliberation captures a universal human competence, which is absolutely essential to effective politics. And so, in that sense, it builds on that core claim, and is always looking to use both theoretical exploration, but also empirical information, empirical testing, to inform the normative project. But the idea that the project could ever be falsified by empirical testing, I think, just sort of really misses the point. Okay, let me now try and apply a bit of deliberative thinking to the multilateralism, decentralization global debate. Actually, the last talk I gave at Earth System Governance was in London 3 years ago, where I gave a plenary talk in which, amongst other things, one of my starting points was Ostrom's claims for effective polycentric climate governance. I went through her conditions, the conditions which, there's a long list of conditions which she suggests is necessary for polycentrism to work. And I argued there that deliberation could help with a lot of those, not all of them, but a lot of those conditions. But I won't repeat that here. A deliberative approach, though, and especially the deliberative systems approach, which is so prominent in the recent theoretical literature, can, I think, help when it comes to thinking about the contribution that decentralization and multilateralism can both make in an environmental governance context. So I've just put a slide up of this is a recent book I did, published in 2014 with Hayley Stevenson, called Democratizing Global Climate Governance. And what we do there is argue that we can use deliberative systems thinking in a normative sense to reconcile some of the claims, some of the positive points of multilateralism and decentralization. We see a proliferation of new forms of climate governance, often loosely associated with the UNFCCC process, sometimes outside it. So various forms of network governance in particular. The ones we look at in the book are the Clean Technology Fund, Verified Carbon Standard, Climate Technology Initiative, Private Finance Advisory Network. But that's just a small example of the number of networked initiatives that are going on globally. Often we find that network governance is low visibility. It often involves corporations. It involves various governmental units, which may be national, can be subnational, but it doesn't get much attention from civil society, from NGOs, from activists. Instead, the activists are all at the UNFCCC. They all show up at the COP. Well, not all of them, but they show up in huge numbers, of course, at the COPs every year. And that's the focus of attention of global civil society is on the UNFCCC process. So arguably, a lot of that's sort of missing a lot of where the action currently is, and these sort of more low visibility network initiatives. So in the book we suggest we talk about the construction of accountability chains which would link network governance initiatives to the UNFCCC process more explicitly and more visibly. Then global civil society could still focus its limited attention and its limited resources and that it can bring to bear on the UNFCCC process, and via the UNFCCC, holding these network initiatives accountable, could at least at one remove help hold these networked initiatives more accountable as well. Okay, but that's just one small illustration of how we can use deliberative systems thinking to help reconcile the decentralized emphasis and the multilateral emphasis in climate governance in particular. Okay. The Anthropocene is in the The theme of this conference is democracy and resilience in the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, of course, as a concept, has achieved huge visibility in this community in recent years. I think some of the early invocations of the Anthropocene in the literature were, I think, often they were rhetorical invocations. Often they involved people just using the Anthropocene concept as an additional justification for what they were doing already. So there was a bit of window dressing going on there. I think that actually applies to the article in Science, the Earth System Governance article in Science in 2012. Very high visibility article in a very very high visibility journal. So it had how many authors? It was a lot. 33 authors, including some of you, and Frank was the lead author. I'll simply note that the title of that article was Navigating the Anthropocene. So Anthropocene is in the title, but the word Anthropocene does not actually appear in the text of the article.
That's a short article.
I know it's a short article, but anyway, it's just an observation. So, however, what I've noticed at this conference is the sophistication that the Anthropocene concept now receives. So there have been several papers which have interrogated the concept a bit more closely and deployed it, and in very, very sophisticated fashion. So that's changing. So we now, I think we do now have a much better sense of what it really means and and the big questions that we have to ask about it. Okay. I'm currently engaged in a project with Jonathan Pickering, who's here, on a deliberative approach to the Anthropocene. The basic argument, on which this rests, is that one of the first virtues of social institutions, as John Rawls suggested, that justice was the first virtue of social institutions. In the Anthropocene, that is not so obvious. We suggest ecosystemic reflexivity can be thought of as the first virtue of social institutions. Reflexivity is the ability of a structure, a process, a set of ideas to change itself in response to a reflection on its own performance. We can link this in deliberative terms to the idea of meta-deliberation, of deliberation about a system's own performance. The ecosystemic aspect comes in. It involves listening more effectively to an active Earth system, the capacity to reconsider core values such as justice in this light, and the ability to seek, receive, and respond to early warnings about potential ecological state shifts. Drawing on the existing literature in deliberative environmental politics, which stresses not just speaking, but also listening and reflecting effectively, we want to explore the potential for deliberative democracy in this context of the demands of the Anthropocene, and there will be some empirical analysis of some particular global environmental regimes as part of that. One of the problems with well, perhaps the core problem as we confront the Anthropocene, as we move from relatively stable Holocene conditions to unstable Anthropocene conditions, is that most of the institutions that we have, that includes multilateral institutions, it includes the state, most of these are developed under relatively stable Holocene conditions. Historical institutionalists tell us that institutions are often path-dependent. That path dependency can be problematic as institutions create their own feedback, which reinforces their own necessity, but doesn't mean that they are any less dysfunctional in a changing world. We would like to explore the idea that deliberative moments can disrupt problematic path dependency. Rhetorical moments can disrupt problematic path dependency too. Rhetoric is not incompatible with deliberation. Rhetoric can be seen as actually part of, as playing key roles in deliberative systems, in advancing new understandings, in reframing the way we think about things. So think, for example, of think of the arrival of sustainable development on the global stage in the 1980s. Really, the achievement of Brundtland in getting sustainable development adopted as the dominant discourse of global environmental governance in the 1980s. It certainly wasn't a matter of scientific proof. It wasn't a matter of adducing any evidence at all. It was really just a rhetorical achievement to proclaim that environmental conservation, economic growth or development, and social justice could be mutually reinforcing. There was actually no evidence to suggest that could be the case. It was simply a rhetorical reframing of some things that had been seen as oppositional. So I'm not suggesting that was a uniquely positive or an unambiguously positive reframing, but it just shows the power of rhetoric, which we can then analyze in deliberative systems terms, in terms of and disrupting problematic path dependency. So there is plenty of work to be done here. As I said, deliberative democracy really can be thought of as a normative project, not a hypothesis which can be readily falsified or confirmed even by empirical evidence. And there is certainly much work to be done in this space.
Thank you very much for these excellent interventions. Now, we will just, before we kick off the discussion, because there are many people here in the room, many questions, I assume, I will invite each speaker to just give a few minutes of reaction, reflection, contestation, or deliberation on the other speakers. So, Frank? Yes?
Okay, thanks. Well, very interesting presentations. I'm looking forward also for your comments to try to be short. I mean, just for Aaron, I think if I looked at your slides and kind of would imagine replacing the word local with global, it would totally not fit. And it's quite interesting. Some of the stuff that you discussed, for example, power to localities. At the global level, it's totally different. It would be power to the states. It would have a totally different meaning in the sense to take over some of these conclusions from the local to the global level and vice versa. I think we really have a scale issue here that concepts, findings, conclusions on one level cannot be transported to the other, or only with big difficulties. I mean, others is also, you mentioned the word of shift in the sense of powers, and this is at a global level different in a way. So there's totally different types of shifts are going on. There is no shift to decentralization because it has never been centralized before. So I think this is something where we can really, in our community, when we work on conceptual terms, and abstract conceptual terms, we have to be very careful what the one paper suggests on a local level cannot be transported to the global, and vice versa, of course. I mean, the conclusions that reach at the global level are not necessarily conclusions that are informative at the local level. So I think it's kind of one thing that's very interesting, maybe also for future projects, to compare language and to really see what are the implications of certain concepts, certain terms that are important at the local level, and how are the same words, the same English words, and how they're playing out at the global level. I think it's kind of a very interesting debate that we maybe have to do more structurally in many ways. But some of this things I also recognize, like soft power, for example. I think it's also very important factor in multilateral institutions, and especially these discourses of decentralization, I think, are a form of soft power in the sense of convincing certain actors to buy in certain visions of how the planet should be run. For John's talk, I mean, many interesting points as usual. I mean, for the experimental part, I mean, like Matthew Hoffman, who is also a member of the Earth System Governance Project, also to show that everything is involved in the sense that we have a broad concept and many people are working on this. I share his interest in the experiments. I'm not sure necessarily his enthusiasm actually, so I have a little more critical perspective. And I don't necessarily share the first part of his book, the strong critique, as he's now also supporting the Paris Agreement apparently. But I think it's very important also to develop, I mean, ideas and to work on these kind of experimentations. But coming back to John's point, we have to look very carefully beyond the enthusiasm into the reality, to what extent these things are really adding up. What we have done in Amsterdam some time ago, we have done a major project on public-private partnerships. So we have kind of looked at all 350 partnerships that came out of the Johannesburg Summit from 2002. And we started with enthusiasm, actually. So when we wrote the grant proposal, we were enthusiastic, said this is this new thing coming out of Johannesburg, we should look at it. And the findings are pretty sober, actually. I mean, we have, many of these, if you look at it systematically, you don't look at the one partnership that is successful and great and also on the website, but you look at the entire system. Then the conclusion is it's actually not really contributing much to effective system governance. So I think that there's more of this is very necessary. And the points of realistic utopianism, I think I actually still don't know really what I use this term, I don't know. I was actually bashed for not being utopianist. People say whatever, that in the end it's an extremely incremental approaches that I'm proposing, but this is probably also a result of the system. I mean, that you have to, and in the end, you have to propose issues or work on issues that are in some form still implementable in your lifetime. In a way. So, this is this reflexivity point I like very much. I think it's very important. Though I think that in the implementation of these ideas, many of those ideas at the global level, we have to be very, very careful about inequalities and disparities in power. I think this will be very. Like, look at this meeting. I mean, this is not it's a nice deliberation, but it's totally biased in favor of a couple of countries. And I'm very afraid that the system, the structures of our global systems are organized in a way that all sorts of deliberation, we did this for online discourses that do not require travel, but just require internet access, which is also not available for everybody, that immediately it shows that these open processes are reproducing power structures that we have on this planet. I think there are certainly ways that also reflect in part of John's work how to deal with this. But I think this is a very, very important challenge to address in these issues. But I think it's very so flexibility. I think it's once I think more about the Anthropocene beyond using in the title, I think this is a very, very important part of it, that we enter a phase in planetary history that is tremendously unstable, uncertain, and dangerous. And reflexivity is there an important part of the reaction from governance systems.
Thank you. Aaron, do you want to both reflect and respond?
Something directly to say.
Oh, you are very eager, John. Do you want to go first?
Actually, let me just I'll just highlight one thing. Frank was very careful to. In his presentation, to distinguish himself from what I'm not sure what I'd call it, but there is a school of thought which is sort of very top down, which in Frank in his talk said that in global governance there is no cockpit, so it's a highly decentralized system. And I think that's true. However, I was reminded of a slightly different metaphor. There was in the follow-up to the big Planet Under Pressure conference, which was held as a prelude to Rio Plus 20 a few years ago in London, which I attended. That was it seems the agenda for that conference was very much set by natural scientists, certainly by people who sort of enthusiastic of planetary boundaries concept. And then in a follow-up editorial in the New York Times, I think it was from Thomas Lovejoy, who used the metaphor of the steering wheel and said it's time for us to get our hands on the steering wheel, essentially manage the planet more effectively. So there is that. I think there is that sort of managerial impetus there somewhere, and coming in part from the scientific community. In Robin Eckersley, in a talk that she gave in this room this morning in the previous session, emphasised that kind of managerial disposition. So I think that disposition is there. And it's something to watch out for in the way future Earth develops, because if the social sciences do become fragmented in future Earth, that instead of having a sort of big social science-based program like a governance, if things are sort of divided up more in terms of functional areas, say that the areas of planetary boundaries, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, whatever, then there is a danger that the social sciences will be seen in this very large sort of science-driven, natural science-driven endeavour as really being in the service of a project which looks much more sort of top-down, natural science-driven by the imperatives as discovered by natural science, and so there's a danger that the virtues of distributed cognition, virtues that non-scientific forms of non-natural science forms of knowledge can be brought to bear. The sort of relatively sophisticated understandings of governance that people get marginalised in favour of a very sort of simplistic sort of top-down, natural science-driven approach to governance. Actually, maybe that's all I'll say for the moment. So, Aaron.
Sure. So, I said a lot, but what I really wanted to say just one thing. That the urge to manage lies so deep in our hearts. We really want to manage things to produce better outcomes. And we have to, and I really like your point about reflexivity, John. I think we have to be reflexive and humble when it comes to our capacity to manage. Every time we try to manage things, I won't use the word, it's a four-letter word, we four-letter it up. So what gives us the certainty that the next time we do it, we'll do it well? I don't know. So Frank, you said, multilateralism is not about centralization, and yet the three proposals that you mentioned, they're all about creating a global body that can hold or that can be a counterweight to the United Nations system. Why? There's plenty of management going on all over the place. Why do we need to have a global body? And the response, I'm sure, would be because there is another global body, which is for states. So we need another one for non-states. If that is not an urge towards centralization, I don't know what is. It's about creating another centralized counterweight to one that already exists. And what will all of these do? So there are examples of successful policies. I don't clearly that is true. But there are so many more examples of utter failures of policy. And I think we just need to think about what is it that we are letting ourselves in for when we commit to act in service of an ideal. Right? And I think it's as important not to want to manage and not to want to do things that everybody thinks is really important to do, and to ask whether you really should be doing it, whether it is sustainability or environment or development, as to throw yourself wholehearted into doing that thing. So that's really all I wanted to say. It doesn't about whether the concept is transposable from the local to the global or the global to maybe it is, maybe it is not. So that's not really. And I was talking about a very specific set of policies which are regarding decentralization of environmental or really natural resource policies. So,
Thank you, Aaron, for those reflections, which I think is a very good bridge to the general question. So we have 25 minutes now, and I think there is some persons with microphones. And please say introduce yourself and try to keep it short and to questions so we can allow for many. Robin, you go first.
Oh, this is a great debate. When you put up a photograph about multilateralism, there were black and white photographs. There were black and white photographs of yesteryear. But would you not concede that multilateralism has evolved? So there's multilateralism 2.0, or there's what a kind of affirmative multilateralism that acknowledges early late developers, cuts leads behind developing countries, and differentiation. We see it in trade, we see it in climate. So, do you think, to what extent do you think multilateralism has capacity to further evolve in this way, in ways that might obviate the need for the sorts of new global architectures that you sketched out? Because the black and white photo sets up a nice other, that was, John Ruggies' Locus Classicus in relation to multilateralism saw it as a compensation for exclusive territoriality that evolved to address that. But he cast it in a way that no longer describes what's happening today in the way that multilateralism now recognised in the treaty. There's a non-state action zone, there are NGOs inside the delegations, there's differentiation in much more nuanced forms. And it's not just about diffuse reciprocity, it's no longer about diffuse reciprocity, it's something more than that.
Okay, we collect some more questions. The gentleman here at this.
Thanks, my name's Ed. I'd just like to pick up on the point, Frank, you talked about some of the inequalities within the global multilateral space. But I'd actually just wonder if John and you could reflect a little bit more on how both decentralized spaces and deliberative spaces could redress rather than reinforce inequalities. But I'd also like to challenge you, John, on your point that you made about climate activists focusing too much on international negotiations. I, among other things, identify as a climate activist, and not far from here, 2 weeks ago, I was carried out of Parliament House. 250 of us held a People's Parliament in public space of Parliament House in the Harbour Foyer. We were later in the week, last week, some of my friends were arrested after they shut down Collins Street in Melbourne for 2 hours, and blocked the entrances to BHP and Westpac for that period, blocked the coal loader at Port Kembla for 2 hours, blocked the port coal loader in Newcastle for 2 hours. I think after Copenhagen, there was a really big acknowledgement that civil society needed to reconnect to the local, needed to be more diverse and really bring everybody on board in the climate movement. So the people who were sitting in Parliament House, the oldest there was a 92-year-old Vietnam War veteran, the second oldest was an 89-year-old elder from up in Gladstone Harbour. It brought together people who were fighting many, many, many local battles in places where there are coal mines being developed, up in the Liverpool Plains. We're fighting against coal seam gas exploration. Students from ANU who should be applauded because they successfully convinced universities.
Okay, sorry, could you please sum up
your
question?
But basically just to say that we are local, we are networked, we are diverse, and we are unruly and disruptive as well. So I'd like to make that point.
Yes,
so thanks very much.
So I have 2 more questions, but I'll let you respond to these 2 first. Who wants to go first?
3 points actually. I mean, first of all, yes, of course, this black and white photos are a rhetorical device. So I do not, of course, there has been a lot of improvement, I would say, in the last 70 years, since 1945. The international system has evolved in many positive directions, I would say. It's a slow process. A slow process for the last 200 years, maybe even. I think it's too slow. I think that still some fundamental principles are not fundamentally changed. I think like civil society participation, I think is largely or partially a cosmetic still. It's a tokenism in a sense. When you go to a COP, I mean, it's full with civil society actors, but it's not any meaningful participation. There's speaking rights, but that is not in any form really integrated into the discussions. I think there's lots of shows, in a sense, where the UN engages in interactive dialogues, in a sense, and they're just meant to fill the coffee breaks. So I think this is, I think the direction is right. It's no longer these black and white pictures, but I would see more enthusiasm, more things to happen. It's not actually that I propose new bodies. I mean, this is kind of, so what the ideas about is also, including John's Deliberative Assembly, don't get me wrong, was to integrate into the current system. So it's not new bodies, it's just second chambers or second bodies that would add new insights within the same decision-making procedure, within the same UN settings. It's not necessarily to add new ones. And I want to very much second what John has said about future Earths, actually. I think that's important because I very much, I mean, I don't believe that there are many of these cockpit people, but there are. And John is right. In the 50 minutes, I was not didn't want to show too much, but there are definitely in the natural science community. I can give you one article, as John Challenger's article from '99 in the Millennium issue of Nature, which has these elements, which has elements of a global reorganization of people and industries according to a master plan drawn up by somebody. Yeah, that's I didn't want to say. Anyway, I mean, this is there. It's a little bit 1990s. I mean, in 1999, if you look some of the IXU documents, they had a committee on Earth system management at that time. This is also one where we try to always distinguish Earth system governance as a free deliberative space in a way, and in Earth system management we leave for the natural scientists and the physicists in a way. But I think, and this is very important, I want to repeat it very much because I'm described as the chair of Earth system government, actually the outgoing chair. So I think it's very important if we want to continue these kind of deliberations among large groups of social scientists about these issues, it's important to maintain this community because there is a different vision of a functional organization according to nitrogen, phosphor, and climate and water, whatever, to split up the social scientists, to stronger integrate with natural scientists, which is on one hand also fine, but as long as the community of social scientists, critical social scientists, can remain together in a substantial critical mass. It's also very important. And this is the challenge, I would say, for those who want to engage in the continuation of the Earth system governance community beyond my term of office. So I think that's very important. It's a call for all of you to engage and help to continue this process.
Okay, John?
Yeah, actually Ed's question was a good one about inequalities in the deliberative process and how we can address them. Deliberation doesn't have to be democratic. It's only democratic to the extent that it is inclusive and egalitarian. And we deliberative Democrats worry a lot about that and have thought about ways of achieving that. So, for example, the Deliberative Global Citizens Assembly, which I've been involved with, is one way of introducing the voices of ordinary citizens throughout the world into governance, global governance processes. I wasn't criticising climate activists for their focus on the UNFCCC. I think it's understandable that, I mean, you pointed to the places where climate activists are present in national and subnational government and on the streets, disruptions and so forth. But one place they're often absent is in the kind of transnational network governance initiatives that I was talking about. That they often are sort of very low visibility and involve very limited range of powerful actors. So I actually think it's so I wasn't criticising activists for not being present in relation to those initiatives. It's actually often hard to find access to them, and also sort of given limited resources in terms of time, energy. It would be unrealistic to expect them to be present in those initiatives. So the idea of sort of constructing deliberative accountability chains from those network governance initiatives to the UNFCCC, and then by that to to, well, I mean, there are problems, as Frank has just suggested, in terms of the real role of civil society in relation to the UN. To what extent there is sort of actually very limited accountability there. So I'm certainly interested in building those building a much more effective role for climate activism into the global governance process in a way which does not impose excessive demands on the time and the energy of activists. And more generally, when it comes to political systems, I think there are moments of contestation, moments of disruption can actually be crucial when it comes to the achievement of effective political liberation.
Aaron, do you want to respond?
Yeah. So one of the most striking phrases that I've heard, and in anything that I've read or talked with anybody about climate, is the statement: "Never in the history of humanity has so few asked so much of so many." And I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but it is a climate scientist referring to the group of climate scientists that he is a part of. And essentially, as Steve Buckler says, we know what is good, we know what is right, and we want everybody in the world to do it. Right now, so the only question that we are now deliberating or talking about is how. How do we do it? Right? So in managerialism, you can identify 3 moments. One is the moment of what might be called domination, the Taylorist moment. Not even tied to the Taylorist. This is how things need to be done. Let me tell you how you must organize work, or how you must organize environmental protection. Right? Or you can think of the scientific or the rationalist moment, where this is how things should be done because this is the right way science tells us. It is not about power, it's about knowledge. Right? This is the right way to do things, and therefore you must do it. And the third is about, you must get everybody involved in doing the right thing. Right? So which of these is the right way to accomplish that goal, or that managerial goal, is what we're talking about. But what I would also like to ask is the goal the right goal? How do we know that's the right goal? So maybe the science that we have is perfect, maybe we don't. So when it comes to climate change, it's very interesting. There's a lot of questions about environmentalism until climate change. Right? So climate change, obviously I'm not a skeptic, nor am I saying that we shouldn't act around climate change. But I guess what I am saying is that when we think about what we need to do around climate change, we need to be suspicious of the ways in which we are asked to do it.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question from Natalie. Natalie, sorry. Yes.
Natalia Malachuk from the University of Waterloo. And so I'm speaking to decentralization, and I'm coming from the localized context, but thinking about decentralization of responsibility versus the decentralization of power, and whether that's from the nation state downwards or upwards to the international arena. I see, and this could also be reframed in terms of the context of expanding the empowered space as well. But I'm wondering to what extent you see this as a challenge or a gap, and in that, what it actually means in terms of regulation in that context of self-regulation, or regulating the regulated. But then as well, is there space within that, if you do identify it as a gap, for deliberation to actually be a vehicle or a way to try and reconcile some of that space or that gap in between the two of responsibility and power?
Then we have Heike and Luke. These two in the front here. Yes.
Hi, Heike from University of Zambia. As you said, we talk a lot about management, top-down, which really means managing others. My question is, what role is there for managing ourselves? To what extent can we be put into a place where we can actually take responsibility and manage? What modes of governance might we need to encourage us to do all of that, rather than pointing fingers at others?
Okay, then Luke.
Luke Kemp, Australian National University. Questions probably a bit for John as well as Frank. What do you think are the linkages between ecosystem reflexivity as a virtue and decision making? So essentially, what's the best decision-making process to encourage or enable ecosystem reflexivity? Just as a first thought, your ability to change a structure or process or set of ideas would be, at the very least, constrained if you had to have every single actor agree.
Okay, one more question to the lady in the second row.
Thank you. It's Christina from the University of Brasilia. A question to Frank. Is it possible to think about multilateralism beyond the nation state? Because we still have this model of multilateralism with nation state in a world organized through nation states. So can we go beyond it?
Sorry.
To learn about the centralization, are there centers? Because I was studying climate change in Brazil and how it went all the way down to the local government. But when I went to interview local government people, they were not doing climate change control or management. They were controlling deforestation. And I asked them, are you worried about climate change? They said no. So, but for the national government, deforestation is the main tool to achieve the targets for lowering the emissions. But to the local level people, it's not that. So.
Okay, and then we have two more questions. Hopefully you can get them, but please respond. Liz, who wants to start?
Well, you can start. But starting about, but by doing it ourselves, I think it's just, I think it's important, and I'm very actively thinking also in the Earth and culture, like in our own communities, on how we can reorganize processes in a way to make this really not only an activity, academic activity, when we have activists here also, but also to how to change processes in a way that our work makes also participation in change. It's not only about our kind of deliberations. I've not really come to a conclusion. I leave this also to the next page in the sense, but I think it's very important also to reorganize academic life in ways that it's not only about describing the world and analyzing the world, but also to change its direction. I think that's something. How to do this on an organization level, I think it's very difficult. For Luke's point, I think I support very much your work on that. I think this is part of the answer. Not that I agree with every sentence, but with many of the sentences, most of them, I guess. But I think this is, part of the answer is to change decision-making procedures at that level. I mean, there's not as different. Every community, every level of governance has to find answers to this complexity. So there's probably some answer of the local level on how to deal with this change concept, the context of the Anthropocene, or generally change, and then local government has to respond in a reflexive way if this is the right solution. At the global level as well. I mean, the global level of governance also has to respond. I think this is important to change decision making, and also, to bring in also then to break up this bureaucratic dominance of our state actors. I think it is important in a more meaningful way to come back to the discussion with Robin, to bring in also non-state actors in an inclusive way. That's also very important. Inclusive, balanced way. And then coming back to Christina's point about multilateralism beyond, I think we have it. I would describe many of these activities that have in the Earth System Governance project very much studied under the agency heading. That's all the types of collaboration of actors that are not states or not central states, of different countries working together. I mean, the famous examples that many people have written books about with the Forest Stewardship Council, these kind of things, the states are not included, or only marginally included, but these are institutions in a sense at the global level. I wouldn't really, that's why I say it's difficult to say it's bottom up was it top down. It's can't really say it's bottom up, but I think they would also disagree that they are top down versus the managers, whatever. But this is somehow, these are elements of multilateral institutions that are taking shape, that have an influence, that shape our life, that take decisions, that are effective to some extent, and that are therefore very important objects of study also. So this is kind of a huge community, and I think when we do the harvesting of the project phase 1, I think that this will be a very, very important part of assessing what all we discovered in a way about how these non-state institutions function in terms of effectiveness, but also equity, representation, etc. How I would describe it. And the term management, I've actually never meant. I don't. Somebody has written it down a note, but I don't use this term necessarily. It's not necessarily about management. I think management at the Earth level is a hybrid of theoretical physicists. It's nothing that works. It's nothing that is seriously discussed.
Okay, John and Aaron, anything?
Okay. Yeah, lots of interesting questions there. I'll just respond to Luke's question on the question of the linkage between ecosystem reflexivity and decision making. I think it's very easy to identify the failings of existing institutions in these terms, in terms of their lack of reflexivity. It's much harder to identify institutions which will be adequate in these terms. All that suggests is that there's plenty of work to be done in the field of system governance in ensuing years, and that's why it's such an important project, is to help identify what more defensible institutions for the Anthropocene would actually look like. I think if we're looking at the positive, I mean, it's much easier to identify the occasional moment of reflexivity in the life of institutions. Often in sort of relatively the moments of discontinuity, windows of opportunity that do open. But it's also if looking at the life of institutions, the times when institutions are stuck in problematic dependencies is much more clear. So if you look at I mean, Frank obviously wants to reform the international system, but there we have a system that was set in place at one moment of opportunity in the late 1940s, and we've been stuck with that system since, and it's increasingly dysfunctional and problematic as we enter a very different era. So critique institutions is obviously essential in terms of their lack of reflexivity. Trying to figure out what more defensible institutions would look like is a much harder task, and task which, as I say, which the Earth System Governance Project really needs to continue to engage.
And just to comment, despite all the praise for Luke's work, it's not done yet. So I think it's a great starting point, but it's not really that you would say this is a solution put in the policy brief. So I think I would encourage everybody to engage in this debate and continue. I think there are many, many more projects that should follow up this innovative beginning. So it's kind of the pioneer. We need to have more of this kind of things.
Aaron, do you have any reflections?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think I would urge also you, Mr. Natalie, you talked about decentralization of responsibility and power, and I would introduce a different term there as well, which is autonomy. So, as I was trying to say, you could have decentralization is about more power. When it is effective, it is about more power. It is about the decentralized body or the agency getting to exercise and having more resources, do things and having resources to do them. Because that's part of what decentralization is about. But the question is, does it have autonomy to decide what it should do? Or is it in relation to the things that it has been asked to use those resources? And I think your question relates very nicely to what Becky was saying, which is, yes, self-regulation is critically a part of decentralization as well, but self-regulation for what? I don't want to go into this Marxist idea of false consciousness, but I think it is important to think about when is it that when you're self-regulating, when is it that those actions of yours, those choices of yours, are more defensible versus less? And that's where I think the issue of reflexivity and deliberation is critical, because without being able to deliberate in a way that is not overdetermined by the political and the social relationships in which are embedded. And that's really almost happens to the impossible. So really everything is overdetermined in those ways. But by enabling some reflection or deliberation to happen that is not fully driven by the by the political relations in which you're embedded. Only through that would it be perhaps possible to identify what about yourself is excellent. Like otherwise, you're just doing what somebody else is telling you to do. Maybe not explicitly, but more or less. And your question, the question that you asked, there's a speech that Lester Brown gave in 1996. And he started the speech, it's about climate change. He started by saying, the cow farts in China, and your children's future is threatened. Right? So the cow doesn't know that it is contributing to climate change. Right? But it may not be the case that people who are doing this or that, what you're doing still has effects. Some of them are known, some of them are intended, and others are not known. And I think that gets to the very heart of the ways in which the debate on climate change and discussion on climate change are so expert-driven. Whether it is the civil society in Paris or in Copenhagen or Cancun or wherever, or it is the political leaders in those cases. They are making decisions without having carried their people with them, for the most part, not in every single time. Right? So when people don't know what it is that their leaders are committing themselves to, that's an exercise in both arrogance and power that has really no place. But for the foreseeable future, that's where we are. That's where we are stuck.
Okay, lunch is approaching. Very soon we are getting hungry, but there's been a gentleman up there waving for long. Okay, that's okay. I think we have one gentleman there. So one final question, and you can save, I saw the other hands waving, but save that for lunch. So one final question and reflections from the panel.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, how do we listen to the Earth system? Because if we admit that, say, the oceans are going to be possibly the major ecological crisis over the next few decades, we can't deliberate with fish and with plankton, but we should. And that raises questions about who represents non-human species and ecosystems, why we continue to bargain human interests against their interests, and how we might plug them into global governance more effectively. Is it time, however pie in the sky it might seem, to start talking about UN Assembly seats for major ecosystems, for species groups? There's obviously an issue of obstruction that's there in any form of governance, of a policymaker assuming the interests of some other group. But it seems to me that may be one implication of the Anthropocene.
Okay. So I give each panelist 1 minute to respond.
I know that we are the only thing standing between you and lunch, so I defer to...
Okay.
It was a comment on John's slide.
Okay, John, you have the final word.
Yeah, this will only take about half an hour.
I tried.
That's what I should say. Okay, there's plenty going on in the democratic theory of representation, which can usefully illustrate how we represent non-humans. I don't think we do it in literal terms. Andrew Dobson, for example, talks about actually appointing representatives to non-humans to deliberate in legislatures. I don't think we should treat representation that literally. I think though that we can design institutions that some institutions are relatively immune to listening to the non-human world, to receiving signals, and some institutions are much better. We can think of centralized versus decentralized institutions in that light, and then think about the characteristics of decentralized institutions that would listen effectively, that would receive more effectively signals from the non-human world. So that's all I'll say. I think there's a working group on ecological democracy which is meeting right now, which can deliberate those sorts of questions much more effectively. But it is possible to think of democratic systems that encompass non-human entities. And a number of green political theorists have done that in 20 years, including Robert Angus.
Great. On that note, we thank all the speakers for an excellent session.